I used to love the quiet in the mornings. Back when everything still felt safe, silence meant peace. The hum of the city waking up outside our apartment window, the slow drip of the coffee maker, the faint sound of Ethan turning in bed, those were the small, perfect moments that made me feel like we were building something real. But lately, that silence had started to feel different. Heavier. Like there was something hiding in it. That Friday, I stood by the kitchen counter, watching sunlight pour through the blinds in thin, golden lines. It hit the framed photo of us sitting on the table, the one from the day we moved in. I looked so happy in that picture. So sure. Ethan had his arm around me, smiling in that way he used to, warm, confident, protective. We'd been here 3 months now. Long enough to unpack everything except the things that actually mattered. Long enough for the walls to feel familiar but not yet like home. Sometimes I still caught myself calling it his place. I poured 2 cups of coffee, one with milk for me, one black for him, and carried them to the bedroom. He was still asleep, hair messy, one arm stretched across the pillow where I'd been lying an hour ago. He looked peaceful, innocent. And for a second, I almost believed we were okay again. I set the cup on the nightstand and stood there for a moment, just looking at him. It's strange how you can love someone so much and still feel a quiet distance growing between you. Like watching fog creep across a familiar road, knowing it's still there underneath, but you can't see where it leads anymore. When I first met Ethan, that distance didn't exist. He had this light in him, ambitious, funny, always dreaming. He could talk about the future like it was already written for us. Our first apartment, our trips, the way we'd host dinners with friends. I fell for that version of him completely. But lately, he'd been changing. It started with small things, checking his phone a little too often, smiling at messages he never explained, coming home later and later because of work. Always work. I told myself not to overthink it. I wanted to trust him. I did trust him. But trust feels a lot like blindness when you start noticing cracks you can't unsee. And lately, one name kept finding its way into everything. Celeste. He met her through someone at work, a mutual friend, he said. She lived only a few blocks away. I'd seen her once or twice at small get-togethers, and she was, well, impossible not to notice. Beautiful, in that effortless way some people are. Always laughing, always surrounded by attention. When she talked to you, she looked right into your eyes, like you were the only one that mattered in that moment. I remember thinking, she's the kind of woman who never has to try to be unforgettable. At first, I liked her. She was friendly. Kind, even. She complimented my dress the first time we met, said she and I should have coffee sometime. But then, she started texting Ethan more and more. Inside jokes. Quick messages. Little things that didn't seem wrong on their own, but together, they started forming a picture I didn't want to see. I told myself it was harmless. Friends joke. Friends text. But sometimes, when I'd ask Ethan who he was talking to, he'd pause, just a second too long before saying, "Oh, just Celeste. She's asking about a project." A project. Always a project. That morning, I stood under the shower, letting the water hit my shoulders, trying to wash away that crawling feeling in my chest. The one that whispered, something isn't right. I didn't want to be that person, the paranoid girlfriend, the one who checks phones or second guesses every late night. But somewhere between the missed dinners and the vague excuses, I'd started losing the ability to tell the difference between trusting him and ignoring my instincts. And deep down, I already knew which one I was doing. By the time I got dressed, Ethan was up. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of half-smile that looks more like habit than affection. "Morning," he said, reaching for his coffee. "Morning," I echoed. He took a sip, nodded like he approved, and asked, "You working from home today?" "Yeah," I said. "Deadlines next week." "Good," he said. "I might have to stay late again tonight." Of course he did. He said it casually, like it was nothing, and kissed my forehead on his way out the door. The door clicked shut and the silence returned. Only this time, I didn't mistake it for peace. That was the morning I decided to stop pretending nothing was wrong. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But I knew I couldn't keep smiling through the uncertainty. So I started noticing things, writing them down. Little patterns that didn't make sense at first, the new cologne I hadn't seen before, the extra toothbrush that disappeared from the bathroom, the faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine. And the strangest one of all, the way his tone changed when he said her name. Celeste. Like it carried something unspoken. Something he didn't want me to hear. I told myself I was imagining it. Until the night I wasn't. That night, Ethan said he was going out for a quick drink with coworkers. I smiled, said okay, even offered to order dinner for when he came back. But as soon as the door closed behind him, I sat in the dark living room and stared at his empty coffee cup on the table. Something about the way he'd avoided looking at me before he left, that tiny hesitation, made my chest tighten. I don't know what I expected to find when I reached for my phone. Maybe I just wanted proof that I was wrong. That I'd made everything up in my head. But the universe has a cruel way of giving you answers you don't want. And that night, I found one. It started with a notification. Not from him, from her. Celeste had posted something on her story. A simple photo, 2 glasses of wine on a small wooden table, candlelight flickering against the glass. The caption read, "Finally, a night off I actually needed." Harmless. Ordinary. Except the second glass. The one across from hers. There was something achingly familiar about it. The curve of the rim, the way the red wine caught the light. I'd seen that exact style before. We had those same glasses at home. Not just similar ones, the same set. Ethan had bought them 2 months ago when we started hosting dinners. Said they made everything feel more grown up. I told myself it was a coincidence. It had to be. But then I looked closer. Behind the table, blurred in the background, there was a reflection in the window, faint, but there. Broad shoulders. A white button-up. Ethan's favorite shirt. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started racing, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I zoomed in, then back out, as if changing the distance would make it untrue. It didn't. The more I stared, the more certain I became. It was him. I set my phone down, trying to steady my breathing. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, felt like it was mocking me. He wasn't out for a quick drink with coworkers. He was with her. And she wanted me to know. Because she could have posted anything else. Any other picture. But she didn't. She chose that one. The one with just enough of him to make me question everything. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. And I understood it perfectly. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, cycling through anger, disbelief, and something else, something sharper. It wasn't heartbreak. That had already started weeks ago, silently eating away at me while I tried to ignore it. No, this was something new. Clarity. The kind that comes when the fog finally lifts and you realize you've been standing in the middle of a storm the whole time. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining it. He was cheating. And she was helping him. The 2 people I'd trusted most, one I loved, one I'd welcomed into my life like a friend, had chosen to betray me together. And the worst part? They probably thought I'd never find out. That thought hurt at first. But then, slowly, it turned into something else. Resolve. Because if they thought I was the kind of woman who would just sit quietly while they laughed behind my back, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Ethan came home around midnight. I was sitting on the couch with a blanket over my legs, pretending to be half asleep. The key turned in the lock, and the door opened with that same quiet click that used to comfort me. Now it just made my stomach twist. He stepped inside, careful, soft-footed, like someone who didn't want to wake me. I could smell the faint scent of cologne, not his usual one. Something new. Richer, heavier. I wondered if she'd bought it for him. He leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "Hey," he whispered. I forced a sleepy smile. "Hey, late night?" "Yeah," he said easily, slipping off his shoes. We stayed longer than planned. "How was your evening?" I shrugged. "Quiet. Watched a movie." "Good," he said, already walking to the bedroom. "I'm exhausted." I waited until he disappeared down the hallway before exhaling the breath I'd been holding. He didn't even flinch. Didn't stutter. Didn't show a single sign of guilt. It was almost impressive, the way he could lie so smoothly, so naturally. Like he'd been rehearsing. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing beside me. Slow, even, peaceful. And in that silence, I started to make a decision. Not out of rage, but out of something colder. Something calculated. If Ethan and Celeste thought they could make a fool out of me, they were about to learn what it feels like to lose everything they thought they controlled. Because I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. I was going to let them think they'd gotten away with it. Let them get comfortable. Let them laugh and whisper and think they were clever. And when the time was right, when they least expected it, I'd take everything from them. Piece by piece. The same way they took it from me. Over the next few days, I played my role perfectly. I smiled when he came home, asked about his day, cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his stories. Every detail of my performance was precise, practiced. Meanwhile, I started collecting my own kind of evidence. I checked our shared calendar. He'd added team meetings on nights he'd never worked late before. I found a receipt in his jacket pocket from a wine bar I'd never heard of, the same one from Celeste's story. He wasn't even being careful. That's how little he thought of me. I didn't need to catch him red-handed anymore. I already knew. But knowing wasn't enough. I wanted to understand how long this had been going on. I wanted to see how deep the lies went. So, one night, when he was in the shower, I opened his phone. He always left it on the counter, face down. I'd never looked before. But that night, I told myself I had every right to know the truth. I used to think the worst sound in the world was hearing someone you love say they don't love you anymore. I was wrong. The worst sound is your own heartbeat pounding in your ears as you scroll through messages you weren't supposed to see. There they were. Hundreds of them. Hidden under a fake contact name, Mark Work. It was Celeste. The messages went back months. Flirty at first. Then intimate. Then unmistakably cruel. Things like, "Can't believe she still has no idea. You should tell her eventually, don't you think?" "Not yet. It's easier this way." My throat tightened. She sent him photos. Not inappropriate ones, just close. Smiling. Always smiling. And he replied with words that used to belong to me. "You're perfect. Miss you already. Wish I could stay longer." I put the phone down and walked to the window, the city lights blurring through the tears I refused to let fall. That was the moment something inside me finally broke, not from pain, but from finality. Because now I knew exactly what I needed to do. And it wasn't forgiveness. It was revenge. I opened his laptop the next morning like someone opening a book that had always been on the shelf, casual, familiar, and for the first time I didn't pretend to be ignorant of chapters one hadn't read. He'd left it unlocked, a mistake he'd been making more often lately, as if carelessness could hide guilt. The files were where he said they were, one folder named Portfolio, another labeled Clients, a third called Archive. I clicked through them without thinking too hard about what I was doing. Images bloomed on the screen, landscapes, wedding shots, experimental portraits. He had an eye. He had a talent I knew I could never take credit for. And then I saw the folder that wasn't supposed to be there, personal. It was small, unlabeled, buried between an old draft and a corrupted file. Inside, dozens of images waited, each one tagged with a date and a place. The thumbnail showed Celeste in graceful, private moments, laughing with a cigarette between her fingers, leaning in close as if whispering a secret. A photograph from the mural we'd visited on our first trip together, and another from the wine bar where she'd posted the glass. It was worse than words, worse than the messages. A photograph, when held long enough, becomes proof. Proof doesn't bend to excuses. Proof doesn't care about context or timing or the gentle way someone brushes their thumb along your wedding band. Proof is a cold thing, and I let it sit in my lap like a small, burning coal. Something in me shifted then. The raw egg dulled into something quieter, sharper. I remembered so many nights where I had swallowed questions, smoothed over doubts, laughed when my stomach told me otherwise. I remembered the way he had kissed me in the kitchen only days earlier and the way his smile had not reached his eyes. I didn't know what form my reaction would take. I only knew it would be considered. I would not be a scene. I would not be a cautionary tale told in sympathetic whispers at coffee shops. If they thought I would crumble or binge some public spectacle, they had overestimated their power. They had underestimated the patient kind of fury that picks through the detritus and learns how to rearrange it into something devastating. My first move was containment. Don't burn bridges. Gather proof. Understand the map of what they'd been doing so I could choose where to place the match. I copied everything. Not because I intended to ruin them for petty reasons, but because the truth had to live somewhere beyond his phone and his memory. I saved folder after folder onto an external drive and hid it in a sock drawer where he would never think to look. I printed a handful of images, the ones that left no room for interpretation, and slid them into a manila envelope that had once held a client contract. I dated them like cataloging evidence because there's a peculiar comfort in chronology, in knowing which lie came first and which came after. Then I built a quiet net of witnesses. There are people in every city who know how to listen without asking for drama: event coordinators, bar managers, people who trade and gossip as casually as tips. I am one of those people by profession. My job is to make other people's moments matter, to smooth edges and keep small disasters private. That anonymity was a tool. I called a few colleagues under the guise of casual conversation, asking about the wine bar, about a photographer who seemed to frequent certain late-night spots. I watched how names moved through networks, making careful notes. The key was to be invisible while being seen. I also paid attention to timing. Celeste had a weekly lecture series at a nearby gallery. She'd mentioned it once offhand. Ethan liked her because she was a mouthpiece for critique, a woman who could make him look smarter by association. I began to frequent those gatherings, always separate from him, always blending into the crowd with a notebook. I listened as she spoke about light and exposure, and the things she said about composition, all phrasing that suddenly echoed in his private texts. The parallels were so exact that it felt like watching someone rehearse a language they'd later use behind your back. When I had enough receipts of bad behavior and enough of the small, clarifying details that make a story truthful, I made the choice I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't eloquent. It was exactly what betrayal deserved: exposure without malice, consequence without spectacle. Celeste was set to chair a marketing event 2 weeks later, a morning gathering of influencers and press. She'd posted about it herself: bright images of an airy room, a list of sponsors. Ethan, with the ease of a man who allowed his lover to be his armor, was on the guest list as her +1. He'd be seen, they'd be photographed, their closeness would become a part of the public record. I created an anonymous email account, not because hacking thrills anyone, but because anonymity gives ballast to truth when truth is inconvenient. I attached the photographs, careful to include timestamps and camera data pulled from the file metadata, and I wrote a short, direct note to the event's PR coordinator. "We think you should know who you are celebrating." I hit send before my hands could shake. Then I waited. The waiting was almost worse than the finding. I carried on with daily life like a woman who owned the night. I organized a client's art launch with the same meticulous care I'd always shown. I answered calls. I made small talk. All of it felt performative in a way that was both exhausting and intoxicating. Each normal moment was a small victory because it meant I was not unraveling for anyone's entertainment. 2 days before the event, the first ripple returned to me. A friend from PR texted that they'd had to postpone a sponsor feature after a sudden complaint about an undisclosed relationship with a paid collaborator. Later that afternoon, an email thread I wasn't on leaked a forwarded message. Someone was concerned about optics, someone else was surprised this hadn't been flagged, and a third was instructing to clarify partnership terms. On the morning of the event, I dressed like I'd never been more myself. Black dress, comfortable heels, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. I had no desire to gloat. Watching them stumble soberly was enough. I stood in the gallery's doorway with a coffee in my hand and a pocket full of other people's opinions, the evidence now a rumor that the right ears had amplified. I didn't need to be seen. The whispers would reach them. They arrived together, she in a light silk blouse, he in a tailored jacket. Celeste moved with composure, but there was a tremor in her smile I watched like a diagnostic line. She shook hands, accepted congratulations. Ethan lingered just close enough to make the room notice. Cameras flashed. The PR people smiled the way trained people do when things have gone sideways, but still hold the line. And then a woman from the sponsor stepped forward, polite and thin-lipped, and asked a question she'd been instructed to ask in private. "Can you clarify the nature of your partnership?" She looked at Celeste, and then at Ethan, and the pause they shared was a pivot. Celeste's answer was quick, practiced. "We collaborate sometimes." Nothing more. Ethan's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. But the look across a room in that instant said everything that words tried to mask. She was the confident one by the lectern, but the ledger of small proofs I'd prepared, timestamps, messages, prints, tightened its hold around her. Someone in the back of the room, a blogger who loved a good expose, whispered the rumor into a phone. The blogger's sister, who was a colleague of a person who oversaw the wine sponsorship, texted a screen cap. Within an hour, the sponsors were having a quiet but fierce conversation with the PR team. By lunchtime, the event's highlight piece had been pulled. By late afternoon, the local blog published a piece about unethical partnerships without naming names, but the photographic evidence, the Polaroid of 2 glasses and a reflection, had been privately circulated to more inboxes than I could count. I did not stand in the center of the storm to watch it unfold. I sat at a nearby cafe and ordered something I had never liked before, because that's what you do when you want to feel something other than the particulars of revenge. I listened to a woman at the next table rant about the state of modern relationships and thought about how small this all was and how seismic at the same time. That night, the fallout found us both. Ethan came home with his face the color of a man who had realized he'd been tracked. He didn't deny anything this time. Denial takes too much energy to sustain when the evidence is already on public circulation. "What did you do?" he asked quietly, standing in the doorway like someone pleading for instruction. I measured my answer like one measures a glass of wine, precise, no need for flourish. "I told the truth," I said. His face went slack for a second, then angry. Who? Who told you?" he demanded. I could have said anything. I wanted to say, "You did it yourself." I wanted to say, "She did it because she likes the danger." I wanted to say 100 things that would have satisfied the part of me that wanted to wound. Instead, I said nothing more. I finished the glass in my hand and set the empty cup on the counter. There are acts that humiliate more quietly than any shout. Leaving him to the consequences of his choices, watching his universe contract while mine expanded beyond his knowledge, was one of them. But consequences ripple unevenly. Sponsors might withdraw, a relationship might implode in public, but these things don't always lead to moral clarity. People forgive, forget, relocate. Scandal consumes and then excretes. Revenge, I realized, needed endurance. It needed patience. It needed a finale that would not let them rebuild on the carcass of my life. So I continued to collect. I continued to place small weights on the structure of their shared lies, an email here, a printed receipt there, a discreet message to a friend who knew how to make a rumor sound credible without turning it into spectacle. I learned how to be invisible and surgical at the same time. And all the while I kept living. I went to work. I met friends for wine. I winced at songs that reminded me of the life I'd had. I learned to sleep on my own terms. I learned how to watch the people who had hurt me slow, stumble, and plan the steps they would take to climb out of the hole they had dug. There is a certain cruelty in that watching, but it's also a form of education. I learned their patterns. I mapped the corners of their pride. I started to understand how to remove the things that feed arrogance, attention, social capital, industry favor, without turning the world against me. One evening, months after the gallery incident and when things seemed to be quieting, a message appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. It contained a photograph and 3 words. "They're going to the cottage." The photograph was of Celeste's hand on Ethan's thigh, an image taken in a different light but the same language of immodesty. The cottage was a small rental far outside the city, a place they'd booked for a weekend getaway. My chest tightened, but not from pain. From focus. I closed my laptop and made tea. The long game had only just begun. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the kettle still humming behind me, steam curling into the air like a question mark. The light outside had dimmed into that bruised violet color that happens just before night fully arrives. I stirred honey into the cup, watched the swirl of gold disappear into the dark, and thought not of Ethan, not even of Celeste, but of precision. Of patience. The long game wasn't about fire. It was about erosion. I didn't want to destroy them with noise. I wanted their foundation to rot quietly beneath them until the day it all collapsed and no one, not even they, could pinpoint when it started. That weekend at the cottage, it felt like an invitation. Not to interfere, that would have been too crude, but to let nature and timing and their own arrogance do the heavy lifting. I'd learned something watching Ethan over the years. He was addicted to being seen as the good man. He'd never risk scandal beyond what he could spin as charm or misunderstanding. Celeste, on the other hand, lived off performance, off the illusion of control. Two people like that can't survive truth for long. So I started collecting threads. Quietly. Gently. Their friends, or at least, the ones still orbiting them, posted everything online. A reflection here, a caption there. I saw the photo before Ethan even sent it to her. His hand on the wheel, sunlight striping the dashboard, her bare knees in the passenger seat. Road trips clear the mind, he'd written. I could almost hear his smugness echoing between the words. I screenshotted it. Not because I needed proof anymore, I had more than enough, but because I wanted to remember the rhythm of his lies. That night, I opened the folder I'd named Seeds. Inside it were all the small, almost invisible steps I'd been taking for months, a copied invoice from one of his freelance clients where he'd billed for additional post-production that never happened, a string of messages between him and a gallery contact where he subtly undercut a rival's project, and a set of emails between Celeste and a sponsor discussing creative ownership that wasn't hers to claim. None of it, on its own, would make a headline. But together, it was a pattern. And patterns, in the right hands, become power. That weekend, while they played lovers in the countryside, I played something else entirely, the part of a helpful acquaintance. I sent a few quiet, well-timed messages. One to the art journal that had recently featured Celeste, asking if they'd verified the originality of her last essay. Another to a client of Ethan's who had complained privately about delays, forwarding an anonymous tip that might prompt a closer look at his work ethic. Nothing overt. Nothing traceable. Just enough to plant questions. And then, I waited. I filled the waiting with ordinary things, work, exercise, nights with friends who didn't ask too many questions. But under it all, there was a calm hum. The kind you feel when the storm is still far off, but you know it's moving toward you. 3 weeks later, I heard the first crack. Celeste's publisher pulled her upcoming column for revision. Ethan lost a retainer job because a client wanted to go in a new direction. They were small losses, nothing catastrophic, but the kind that eat at people like them, people who build their lives on constant validation. He came home quieter after that. Spent more time in his studio, less time looking me in the eye. We were still living under the same roof then, our separation unspoken, stretched like an elastic that neither of us had yet decided to cut. I pretended ignorance. I cooked dinner. I smiled when he talked about a weird slump in the industry. I even listened when he said he might rebrand. Inside, I cataloged every word. One night, he asked, "Do you think people can change?" I looked up from my plate. Change? Yeah. He shrugged, eyes on the table. Like, learn from what they've done. Be better. It took everything in me not to laugh. I set my fork down, leaned back in my chair. People can, I said softly. But not everyone does. He nodded, pretending to think deeply about it, as if this were some philosophical debate between equals and not a confession disguised as conversation. After that, I started preparing for the finale. The finale wasn't a single act. It was a sequence, a slow unwinding of everything he'd built, until even he couldn't tell which piece had broken first. The first thread I pulled was professional. Ethan had a habit of using other people's work, subtly, cleverly, as reference points in his own. Normally that's forgivable, but I'd found a series of files in his backups that crossed a line, client photos with metadata from other photographers' shoots. A quiet email to the right creative agency, paired with an anonymous file drop, was all it took. The second thread was social. I made sure Celeste's gallery contacts began hearing about her sources. The art world thrives on reputation, and once someone starts whispering that your work isn't fully your own, your invitations dry up faster than paint in the sun. The third thread, the one that mattered most to me, was personal. Ethan and I shared mutual friends, couples who still thought of us as solid, as the dependable ones. They'd seen the cracks, but they'd blamed stress or long hours. I never told them the truth, not all of it. I didn't need to. Instead, I let them see what he wanted to hide, his indifference, his neglect. A dinner party here, a casual remark there. I didn't lie. I simply stopped covering for him. When someone asked why he hadn't joined me, I'd say, "He's with Celeste, I think," like it was no secret at all. I'd smile kindly. They work together a lot. That's all it took. The next time we attended a group gathering, I watched how eyes followed him, not with admiration anymore, but curiosity. Skepticism. The quiet kind that spreads like smoke. He noticed it too. He tried harder after that, flowers, compliments, small gestures that used to melt me. But the timing was wrong now. I'd already stepped outside the orbit of his charm. And every time he tried, I met him with calm neutrality. Nothing feeds guilt like indifference. By the time autumn came, his life had slowed into something unrecognizable. The calls were fewer. The collaborations thinner. Celeste had vanished from public events after a hiatus, she announced with an overlong caption about self-care and reflection. One evening, he came home early. He stood in the doorway, hands buried in his pockets, and said quietly, "Did you do this?" I looked up from my book. "Do what?" He hesitated. His throat worked around words he couldn't form. Finally, he said, "Everyone's turning on us. It's like someone's." I smiled, just slightly. "Maybe people are just seeing you clearly." He stared at me for a long time, as if he wanted to say something cruel, something final. But he didn't. He turned away, walked to the window, and I knew then he understood, maybe not the details, but the inevitability. Because that's the thing about the long game. It doesn't roar. It doesn't scream. It just waits, patient and precise, until the people who thought they were untouchable realized that every quiet choice they dismissed was a step toward their own undoing. And I was nowhere to be found in their story anymore. At least, not where anyone could point and say my name. When he finally left, it wasn't with an argument or an explosion. It was just silence. A suitcase by the door. A note that said, "I need space." He thought space would save him. He didn't know I'd already given him all the distance in the world. In truth, he'd been a ghost in our home for months before his body caught up to the idea. There were nights I'd hear him walking in the hallway, aimless, pacing like a man trying to remember what room was still his. His toothbrush remained in the cup beside mine, his jacket still hanging by the door, but every trace of him felt borrowed, like an echo waiting to fade. After he left, I stood in that same doorway and looked at the space he'd once filled. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt earned. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying his weight. I went about my days slowly, deliberately. I rearranged the furniture, changed the scent of the laundry detergent, swapped out the curtains. Tiny rituals of cleansing. It wasn't about pretending he'd never existed, it was about reclaiming the air he used to breathe. And yet, despite all that peace I'd built, there was still one unfinished thread, the one person who had benefited from my kindness and twisted it into betrayal, Celeste. Ethan was gone, but she was still out there, painting herself as a visionary, as a misunderstood artist taking a break from the toxic demands of the creative world. I saw her posts sometimes when mutual acquaintances shared them, filtered light, poetry quotes, and captions about rebirth. She was trying to shed the skin of the scandal I'd quietly orchestrated. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about truth. She'd built her entire career on mimicry, on stealing the ideas and emotions of others, and stitching them together with self-righteous words. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the ending to our story. So I watched. I waited. 3 months after Ethan left, Celeste announced an upcoming exhibition, The Anatomy of Trust. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. The promotional poster featured her standing in a field, barefoot, holding a cracked mirror. It was everything she loved, symbolic, dramatic, hollow. But what caught my attention wasn't her face, it was the quote beneath it. It was mine. A line from a private message I'd sent her a year earlier when she was pretending to be my friend, asking for feedback on a series of essays she was writing. She'd taken my words, stripped my name, and printed them beneath hers. That was the final insult. So I did what I always did best. I stayed quiet, calm, and methodical. First, I reached out to an old acquaintance of mine, Marina, a curator who worked in the same gallery circuit as Celeste. We hadn't spoken in years, but Marina had always respected professionalism above all else. I sent her a short, polite email with a link to the exhibition and a brief note. I believe one of the quotes featured in this collection might have been lifted from a private correspondence without permission. I'm sure this was unintentional, but thought you'd want to be aware before the opening. Attached was the screenshot of my original message, timestamped and complete. Then I waited. 2 days later, I received a reply. Marina thanked me for reaching out and promised to look into it. A week after that, Celeste's exhibition page quietly changed, the quote removed, replaced with an unrelated one. No apology, no public acknowledgement. Just a quiet correction, as if it had never existed. But the damage was done. You see, the art world isn't as glamorous as it seems. It's a network of whispers, of people who smile to your face while trading gossip over coffee the next morning. And when the word spreads that your work is inspired a little too heavily by others, your career doesn't explode, it decays. I didn't have to do anything more. The whisper had already been set loose. Meanwhile, Ethan's career had flatlined. The last I heard, he'd tried to start a new agency with a few freelancers, but it never gained traction. His name had become synonymous with unreliable. One of his clients, the one I'd anonymously tipped months earlier, had shared their experience with others, and that ripple spread quietly through the industry. Every so often, I'd catch his name on a LinkedIn update or an article's byline, but it was always attached to something small, almost desperate. Sometimes I wondered if he ever connected the dots. If he realized that the slow collapse around him wasn't bad luck or karma but precision. That every door that quietly closed had been guided shut by a hand he once thought incapable of harm. But I didn't dwell on it. I had moved on, truly. I started freelancing again, throwing myself into work that made me feel alive. I reconnected with people I'd once neglected while trapped in the orbit of his ego. There were mornings I'd wake up and, for the briefest moment, forget there had ever been an Ethan or a Celeste. That's when I knew I'd finally taken back my life. And yet, there's always an and yet. One evening, nearly a year after he left, I got an email from Ethan. The subject line, closure. My pulse quickened. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Nora, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For how it ended, for how I treated you, for not seeing what I had until it was gone. I've been through a lot this year. Lost friends, clients, opportunities. I guess it's karma. I keep wondering if you had something to do with it, but honestly, I wouldn't even blame you if you did. You always deserved better. If you ever feel like talking, I'd like to hear from you. If not, I understand. I stared at the screen for a long time, the blue light turning my tea cold. For a brief second, the old ache stirred, the one that wanted to answer, to explain, to grant him the closure he thought he needed. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to say, forgiveness isn't for the one who hurt you. It's for the one who's free of them. So I clicked delete. Not archive, not mark unread. Just delete. No parting words, no catharsis, no grand finale. Because real revenge isn't about the drama. It's about the silence afterward, the peace that follows when the noise finally dies down. And mine was absolute. Still, on some nights, when the city outside goes quiet and the moon hangs low, I think about him, not with bitterness, but with a strange, detached curiosity. I wonder if he ever learned what it means to look at someone and see the whole of them, not just their reflection in your own ego. And then I smile to myself, sip my tea, and close the window. Because I already have all the answers I need. I'd spent years searching for explanations that were never mine to find: why he lied, why she betrayed me, why people hurt the ones who would have stood by them through anything. But the truth is, some people just don't want love. They want admiration, validation, and audience. When you stop clapping, they go looking for someone else who will. So, I stopped clapping. And in that silence, I found something I didn't know I'd been missing: myself. The months that followed weren't perfect. Healing never is. There were nights I'd wake up suddenly, heart racing, because I dreamed he was still there. There were mornings when I'd open my eyes and reach for a presence that no longer existed beside me. But each time, that ache faded a little faster. And each time it did, I filled the space he left with something better, something real. I painted again. Not professionally, not for approval, just for me. My little apartment slowly filled with canvases, messy and unpolished, full of color and emotion. There was a freedom in that imperfection. I started saying yes to things I'd once avoided: book clubs, weekend trips, even dating apps. Not because I was looking for anyone, but because I wanted to remember what possibility felt like. My friends said I seemed lighter. I laughed easier, talked more. I wasn't constantly waiting for something or someone to fall apart. And maybe the universe noticed, because one evening at a local art fair, while I was sipping cheap wine and pretending to understand a sculpture made of bicycle parts, someone bumped into me. He was tall, a little awkward, with paint smudged on his forearm and a smile that looked like it had never learned to fake itself. His name was Daniel. We talked for hours that night about art, travel, heartbreak, everything. There was no sparkly movie magic, no instant fireworks. Just warmth. Ease. He didn't ask about Ethan. I didn't offer. We just existed in that moment, two people who'd both been through enough to appreciate quiet honesty. And as the months passed, that quiet honesty grew into something unexpected. Something steady. Something kind. Daniel never promised me perfection, and that's what made me trust him. He simply showed up again and again, with small gestures that spoke louder than any declaration. A hand on my back when we crossed the street. A text before bed. A cup of coffee left by my pillow on mornings he left early. He didn't try to fix me. He just let me be. And in return, I let myself believe again. It wasn't that I forgot what Ethan and Celeste had done. I just stopped letting it define me. Their betrayal had been a storm, but storms end. What comes after is quieter, yes, but it's also fertile. That's when the ground is ready for new things to grow. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything unraveled, I found myself walking past a gallery downtown. The sign in the window stopped me cold. The Anatomy of Trust, retrospective exhibit by Celeste Lang. So she'd done it again, rebranding, reinventing, rising from the ashes of her own deceit. I almost kept walking. I almost didn't care. But then I thought about all the nights I'd cried wondering if she'd ever face the weight of what she'd done. And I decided I wanted to see for myself. The gallery was smaller than I expected. Sparse white walls, dim lighting, the faint scent of varnish and ambition. People murmured softly, wine glasses in hand, their voices echoing in curated admiration. Celeste stood at the center of it all, dressed in black silk, her blonde hair perfectly arranged, every inch the tragic genius reborn. She was talking animatedly to a reporter, gesturing toward a piece titled Reconstruction. I recognized the brushstrokes immediately. They were mine. Not literally, she hadn't stolen a painting, but emotionally. The entire composition mirrored something I'd once shown her years ago, back when I still believed she was my friend. The color palette, the fractured layering, it was a mimicry so specific it could only have come from memory. She caught sight of me then. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered. Just a flicker. But that was enough. I didn't confront her. I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled, nodded once, and walked out. Because that was the difference between us. She still needed the world to see her. I didn't. That night, I went home, curled up on my couch, and watched the lights of the city blink through my window. Daniel called a little later, asking if I wanted to get dinner. I said yes, smiling into the quiet. After we hung up, I opened my old journal, the one I'd stopped writing in the week Ethan left, and on the first blank page I wrote, "Closure isn't about getting answers. It's about no longer needing them." And that was it. No elaborate revenge, no lingering bitterness. Just peace. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge isn't destruction. It's happiness. The kind that can't be faked, can't be stolen, and can't be destroyed by anyone else's lies. It's the kind that glows quietly in your chest when you realize finally, truly, that you've moved on, and they never will. And as I turned off the lights and let the city fade into the soft hum of night, I whispered to myself the truth that had taken me years to learn. Some stories don't need to be rewritten. They just need to end. And mine had ended exactly the way I wanted it to. But endings, I've learned, aren't always final. They're pauses, soft, deliberate breaths between the life that was and the life that's waiting. A few weeks after that gallery night, I received an email. No subject line, no greeting. Just a single link. It was from a shared contact, one of those mutual friends who still floated between worlds, someone who'd known me before everything fell apart. I almost deleted it without opening. I didn't owe the past another second. But curiosity is a strange thing. It whispers, what if? So I clicked. The link opened to a video, an interview clip, maybe 5 minutes long. Celeste again, sitting across from an arts journalist. She was poised, elegant, her voice calm and self-assured. But what caught me off guard wasn't her confidence. It was what she said. Every artist paints from pain, she said. And I think, sometimes that pain comes from realizing we were the villain in someone else's story. The interviewer nodded, asking something I couldn't quite hear over the sudden ringing in my ears. Celeste smiled. It wasn't fake this time, not the polished grin she'd worn at the gallery. It was smaller, sadder. I hurt people, she said quietly. Ones who didn't deserve it. I think the hardest part of creating now is knowing I'll never be able to give them back what I took. For a long time after the video ended, I just sat there. Not angry. Not vindicated. Just still. Maybe it was an act. Maybe she'd learned to weaponize remorse the same way she once used charm. Or maybe, for the first time, she was being honest. Either way, it didn't matter. Because the version of me she hurt, the one who would have replayed her words, dissected them, wondered if forgiveness was possible, didn't exist anymore. I closed the tab and deleted the email. And that was that. But the universe has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Because the very next morning, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years, Ethan. It was at the farmer's market of all places. A lazy Sunday morning, sun-drenched and peaceful. I was walking with Daniel, hand in hand, picking out fresh peaches, when I heard my name. I turned, and there he was. For a second, I didn't recognize him. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. His hair was shorter, his clothes plain, his smile unsure. "Nora," he said. "Hey." Daniel squeezed my hand gently. I smiled and introduced them. Ethan extended a hand. Daniel shook it, polite but guarded. Ethan looked like he wanted to say something else, maybe a dozen things. But the words seemed to die in his throat. He just nodded, awkward, and said, "You look good." "Thank you," I said, calm and even. "You too." We chatted briefly, surface level, polite, meaningless. The kind of conversation you have with someone who used to be a chapter in your story, but no longer belongs in the next. When we said goodbye, Ethan hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, then back to me. "I'm glad you're happy," he said. And I realized, for the first time, that I truly was. Not the kind of happiness that comes from revenge or closure or proving something. Just the quiet, steady kind, the one that grows from peace. When we walked away, Daniel glanced at me. "You okay?" I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." That evening, I found one of my old canvases, an unfinished painting from years ago. It had started as a portrait of two faces merging, but I'd abandoned it halfway through, unable to finish. Now, as I studied it, I realized why. Back then, I was trying to make sense of something broken. Now, I didn't need to. So I picked up my brush and painted over it completely. Layer by layer, color by color, until what remained was something entirely new, vibrant, messy, alive. When I stepped back, I saw it for what it was. Not an ending. A beginning. And that's the truth about betrayal. It doesn't destroy you. It remakes you. It strips away everything false, everything fragile, until what's left is something honest. Someone honest. Someone like me. Because I'm not the woman who waited for explanations anymore. I'm the woman who built a life out of the ashes of one. And if Celeste ever sees my work one day, maybe in some small exhibit, maybe in the background of a magazine, I hope she recognizes it. Not as revenge, but as proof that even when people try to steal your light, you can still find ways to shine. Because some betrayals burn you to the ground. But if you're lucky, they also teach you how to rise. And me? I didn't just rise. I learned to soar. A year later, that truth became more than just a metaphor. It was late spring when my first solo exhibition opened. Nothing grand, nothing headline-worthy, just a modest corner of a downtown gallery with whitewashed walls and soft jazz playing through the speakers. The sign out front read Resilience, Works by Nora. I'd painted every piece myself, no assistance, no deadlines, no expectations. Each one carried a fragment of my story, told not through words, but through brushstrokes, textures, and light. There were storms and sunsets, quiet rooms and silhouettes caught between leaving and staying. But none of it screamed pain. It whispered healing. When the gallery owner dimmed the lights for the evening and the first guests began to trickle in, my hands trembled a little. Not from nerves, from disbelief. I'd spent so long being defined by what had happened to me that I hadn't realized how far I'd come. And then, right as I was greeting a couple admiring a painting called The Space Between, I saw her. Celeste. She was standing at the entrance alone. Her hair was shorter now, her expression softer. For a second, I thought I was imagining her, some ghost from an unfinished story come to haunt me one last time. But she was real. And she looked uncertain. Our eyes met, and the room seemed to still. She hesitated before stepping forward, clutching her bag like it was some kind of anchor. "Hi, Nora," she said quietly. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Not fragile, just human. "Hi, Celeste." She glanced around the gallery, her eyes landing on one of the larger canvases near the back, Reclamation. A swirl of warm tones bleeding into a single golden line, breaking free from darker edges. "This one's yours?" she asked softly. "All of them are." She nodded, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." There was a pause. Long, heavy, but not uncomfortable. She shifted her weight, then met my gaze again. "I saw the article in the paper," she said. "The gallery owner mentioned you used to teach. That you left your old job to paint full-time." "I did." "You look happy." I tilted my head slightly. "I am." She exhaled slowly. "Good. I'm glad." And for once, I believed her. There was no manipulation in her tone, no hidden motive in her eyes. Just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that comes from seeing someone after years of pretending they didn't exist. "I'm sorry, Nora," she said. "Not because I want forgiveness. I just needed to say it out loud." I studied her for a moment, this woman who had once been my closest friend, my confidant, my betrayer. I searched for anger, for resentment, for the ache I thought I'd feel. But all I found was distance. Time. Growth. "I know," I said softly. And maybe once I needed to hear it. But not anymore. She blinked. "Does that mean you forgive me?" I smiled faintly. "It means I don't need to." Her lips parted, but no words came. She nodded slowly, as if she understood exactly what I meant. We stood there a while longer, surrounded by color and silence. Then she said, "You've built something beautiful." "I built myself back," I replied. Celeste smiled, small, genuine. "You always had that in you." And then she left. No dramatic exit. No tears. Just two people passing each other at the end of a long, broken road, both walking their own directions now. After she was gone, I stood in front of Reclamation. I traced the edge of that golden line with my eyes and realized something I hadn't before. It wasn't escaping the darkness. It was threaded through it. Because that's what healing really is, not erasing what happened, but weaving it into who you become. Later that night, as the gallery emptied and Daniel wrapped his arm around me, I leaned my head against his shoulder. He whispered, "You did it." I smiled. "No," I said. "I became it." And when I looked out through the window, at the streetlights and the people walking by, strangers with their own stories of love and loss and survival, I realized something simple but profound. Pain doesn't end you. It introduces you to yourself. And sometimes, it even paints your masterpiece. That was the night I finally let everything go. The anger. The memories. The versions of me that used to ache for closure. Because I had closure now. It was hanging on every wall around me, signed in my name. And as the last light dimmed, I whispered a quiet truth, not to Ethan, not to Celeste, not even to the girl I used to be, but to the woman I'd finally become. You made it. And for the first time, I truly believed it.